A cursory glance at the mythology of any number of Mediterranean civilizations, those of the first centuries before the Common Era and of the Common Era, reveals that there were several demigods and gods that conquer death and make a triumphant return in the springtime. Osiris from Egypt, Dionysus from Greece being two of the better known, other than Jesus, of course. In fact, one can find any number of parallels between the stories of these two gods and the traditional story of Jesus, from birth to death and resurrection. The skeptic need not look far to find evidence to doubt a factual account of the traditional Easter story. This being said, it is worth asking why the idea of resurrection was so prevalent in these ancient cultures, and why it remains such a popular notion still today. It's easy to be skeptical, to pick apart all the many ways these traditional stories do not conform to our modern scientific understanding of nature. That assumes, of course, that the intent of the story is to be an historical accounting of actual events. That's what many of us were taught, but was that how they were intended? Now, the world has changed considerably in the past 2,000 years. We have learned so much about the nature of reality and ourselves through scientific investigation. In the face of the Hubble photographs of distant galaxies and the decoding of the human genome, in the light of technology that routinely brings people back from the brink of death and allows us to communicate on a global scale in real time. Given all of this, it's real easy to discount those ancient stories and myths as quaint and even irrelevant to our modern people. The problem with skepticism, however, is that most self-defined skeptics neglect a very important part of being a skeptic. They will question almost all traditional religious beliefs and practices. They may even question the validity of certain scientific theories and practices. But what too often happens is that skeptics fail to bring into question their own skepticism. A true skeptic will not forget to question their own motives and biases. A skeptic uses doubt as a tool in the pursuit of truth and meaning, and not merely as an easy excuse to dismiss anything and everything that does not conform to one's preconceived notions of how the world works. A true skeptic, for example, will naturally question the facts of the Easter story, not to dismiss it, but to search for the deeper truth that may be hidden in the story. A true skeptic questions why so many cultures had similar myths and wonders what role they played. And asks, have we as human beings changed so much? Our technology has changed in 2,000 years, but has human nature changed? So why would all these stories perpetuate across cultures and through time if they didn't serve a real and present need? Now, Michael Bagent, author of the Jesus Papers, exposing the greatest cover-up in history, he does not believe in the physical resurrection of Jesus. He does believe that Jesus was crucified, placed in a tomb, and believes that Jesus was not in that tomb 3 days later. He argues that Jesus did not die on the cross. But through political maneuvering, his followers were allowed to remove him from the cross before he died. And so was put into the tomb alive and then was removed. He also argues that Jesus may have been associated with a Jewish temple located in Egypt, a temple that was not under the influence of the ruling class in Jerusalem, which was, for the most part, collaborating with the Roman occupiers. Recognizing that the fact that so many Mediterranean cultures maintained spiritual traditions relating to the idea of resurrection, and that those cultures had secretive societies that utilized ritual practices and caves constructed exclusively for the purpose to simulate death and resurrection for their practitioners, Pageant argues that Jesus may have been a member of a Jewish mystical tradition centered in Egypt and was called to bring this message of that tradition to the people of Israel. Now, frankly, I'm a little skeptical of his arguments. Most of his evidence is circumstantial at best, but I admit that his version of the story is at least as believable as most. In almost saying that same thing, Pageant himself writes, "It should be clear by now that history is malleable. We have our facts, but we never have enough of them to be able to put our hands on our hearts and say, in all honesty, that we know for certain what happened." He continues that all history is a myth, a story created to make some sense out of the few events that we do know. The past is an hypothesis erected to explain and justify the present. In some ways, this does not matter, for myths exist to communicate meaning, not history. This is such a critical point. Myths exist to communicate meaning, not history. And when we dismiss them out of hand for their factual inaccuracies, we are making the exact same mistake as those who argue that mythological events are factual. Regardless of what we may or what may or may not have happened 2,000 years ago, regardless of the historical accuracy of the death and then resurrection of Jesus, regardless of even the historical existence of Jesus, resurrection is a fact of life. A scholar and author, Marcus Borg, he makes the point that resurrection is not the same as resuscitation. Resuscitation is the physical regeneration of life in a dead body, and resurrection, as he defines it, is a spiritual reality and a religious process. When we differentiate the ideas of the death and resuscitation of the physical body from the metaphorical idea of resurrection, then we find that no physical laws are being broken on Easter morning when Christians announce that he is risen. My colleague, the Reverend Jim Eller, points out, of course Jesus' disciples did not find him in the tomb. If they were looking there, then they were looking in the wrong place. The empty tomb was their hearts, which had been made empty by the enormity of their loss. As long as those who would seek to understand resurrection look into a literal tomb, they will not find the post-Easter Jesus or the new life promised there, he says. So when we understand that resurrection is a metaphorical, in this metaphorical sense, then most of us can likely find examples of it in our own lives, in the lives of loved ones. Fear, hate, despair, cowardice, confusion, loss of hope or loss of faith can cause anyone to turn inward and retreat into the tombs of our lives, writes Eller. Sometimes it's called the dark night of the soul. for those who have experienced it and know that tomb to be real. To many people, the story of Jesus' suffering and eventual resurrection resonates with our own experience. And so it helps us find meaning and purpose in our lives. That is what mythology does, helps us make sense of it all. Helps us recognize that our story is part of a bigger story. Karen Armstrong, in her book, 12 Steps to a Compassionate Life, she points out that a myth makes sense only if it is translated into action, either ritually or behaviorally. It is comprehensible only if it is imparted as part of a process of transformation. Now, when I was young, back when spring break was called Easter vacation, it always bothered me that while my public school friends had the week before Easter off, my Catholic school took the week after Easter off. Because the week leading up to Easter, that's Holy Week. And so we needed to be there. Now, as I remember it, every day of Holy Week meant an hour or two at church doing the Stations of the Cross. At the 14 different stations, which in total describe the events of Good Friday, from condemnation to being placed in the tomb, we heard the story and recited the prescribed prayers. The Stations of the Cross, or Via Dolorosa, the path of grief and suffering, allows adherents to put themselves into the story, to recognize that Via Dolorosa isn't merely the story of Good Friday. It is a path to spiritual transformation. In mythological terms, it serves as the invitation for the devotee to pick up their own cross and to follow the path towards divinity. Joseph Campbell used the term, the call to adventure. This was the call to adventure. So your cross, your burden, that which breaks your heart, may have been put upon your shoulders by life's circumstances, or you may have felt compelled to pick it up. Regardless, it is your cross. And our crosses include addiction, a violent temper, depression, chronic disease, or any number of other afflictions. Our crosses include not only what afflicts us personally, but also what affects others, what affects the world, because it afflicts us as well. What breaks your heart above all other things in the world? What breaks your heart? Poverty, homelessness, injustice, animal rights, war, oppression, environmental degradation. This is your cross, your burden to bear, to be transformed by love on this path. Easter, resurrection, spiritual transformation is where this path leads us. It challenges us, and it changes us. Joseph Campbell recognized that this path, the Via Dolorosa, the path of suffering, is yet another example of the hero journey he saw in all the world's religions. It's a cartoon version of it. Pain and suffering are part of life. Does anybody disagree with that? All right, we can agree that pain and suffering are a fact of life. But we do have a choice what to do with the pain and suffering in our life. Do we let it consume us, or do we instead choose to let it transform us through a process of conscious reflection and action? Myth has been aptly described as an early form of psychology, says Karen Armstrong. The tales about gods threading their way through labyrinths or fighting with monsters were describing an archetypal truth rather than an actual occurrence. The Via Dolorosa, Stations of the Cross, is just another form of a labyrinth. I used to suffer from severe bouts of depression, crippling depression. At times, the mere thought of just leaving the house was too much. I would blame back problems or some other physical problem rather than admit to others what I was going through. I finally moved past those depressive episodes, and I did it with a single thought. It occurred to me that my depression wasn't the real problem. It occurred to me that perhaps my depression was just a symptom. So instead of fighting it and denying it, I started to listen to it. Kind of like listening to a pain in your body that is telling you something isn't right. So I listened to my depression. And it taught me that I wasn't living the life I was born to live. I wasn't being authentic to myself. So as a result of my listening, I began exploring different spiritual paths, eventually finding Unitarian Universalism. As a result of my listening, I put myself on a new career path, which finally led to becoming a minister. Those were just a few of the bigger changes I made. There were countless smaller other ones, and they didn't happen all at once. But over time, as I traveled the Via Dolorosa, the path of suffering. And what I finally came to understand about myself was that I had put myself in a box not of my own making. I was following a path that was not my own. Looking back, I recognized that depression was the cross I had to bear. And I had to accept it and go through the many trials and tribulations and finally to die on that cross. My last major depression was when I lost a job. I'd lost a job because of a depression. And I was totally broke and alone. And I finally sought help. I reached out to family for help and admitted my problem. And the person that I had thought I was supposed to be died. And from it came a whole new life filled with meaning and purpose. The Via Dolorosa is a way of looking at the events of our lives as though they're part of a story. It's the hero's journey that Campbell described. And we all have a story. And they're all joined together in different ways. So why, when we ask, why do so many cultures have such similar stories? Why was Joseph Campbell able to recognize this pattern in cultures from all around the world, from cultures living in the coldest reaches of the Arctic and from the hottest deserts and on islands in the middle of the Pacific? All of their stories shared a common pattern. Why? Is it because that is how we work? Is that how our minds work? That is psychology of our own stories. Easter, resurrection, the stations of the cross. They aren't so much about what may or may not have happened a few millennia ago. They're about you and me and what's possible every single day. Easter is but the reminder that divinity dwells in all of us, just waiting for us to shed the limits of our own thinking, the limits of our fears and our doubts. It's a reminder that no matter how bad things may be on the path of life, there is always hope. It's just as there can be no spring without winter, there can be no Easter without Good Friday. It's unfortunate, but it's a fact that we human beings always seem to have to learn the hard way. We have to go through the pain and suffering in order to see what really matters. So Easter will always come. That is the message here. And if you can't find it in your heart, if you can't find the hope of Easter, it's there. It is there. And it's around you. And it might mean letting go of who you think you are. It might mean letting go of who you think you should be. Of letting go and submitting to that path. Going down that path of suffering. And stop fighting it and find it there. Because hope is there. The hope of Easter is always there. The hope of spring is always there. It's not always visible. And when things get really bad, it's hard to imagine. But together we will make it happen. Together we make Easter happen. And it won't be necessarily today or tomorrow or the next, but it will happen. So be it. Amen. Blessed be.